All right, 10 minutes is over. Let's jump back into it. It is to my delight that we have a second paper today by another equally esteemed specialist in the study of ancient Gnosticism and later Greek philosophy. It is with a great pleasure that I may introduce Tuomas Rasimus. Tuomas Rasimus earned his PhD as a joint enterprise between the Université Laval and the University of Helsinki in 2006-2007, and has worked since at the University of Laval in Quebec City, as well as at the University of Helsinki. And today he remains a docent at the University of Laval. He's also been, what's that?
Helsinki, not
at
Laval.
Helsinki. Excuse me. Thank you, Tuomas. He's also been affiliated with as such diverse and prestigious institutions as Princeton University, the University of Copenhagen, the Institutum Romanum Finlandiae, the University of Bergen in Norway, McGill University. Tuomas's books and research on Gnosticism, Platonism, and early Christianity are well known. And I have the luck of having a number of his publications here in my office. Of course, his groundbreaking dissertation, Paradise Reconsidered in Gnostic Mythmaking, Rethinking Sethianism in Light of the Ophite Evidence, published in Nag Hammadi and Manichaean Studies in 2009, putting the Ophite Gnostics back on the map after they've been neglected, as well as Stoicism and early Christianity, reminding us of the important background of Stoic philosophy for early Christianity. And then, of course, his many edited volumes, such as Gnosticism, Platonism, and the Late Ancient World, the Essays in honor of John Turner, and most recently, the Platonizing Sethian background of Plotinus's mysticism, co-edited together with a team of researchers revising the dissertation of Zeke Mazur. It is thus my honor to introduce Tuomas to take up the question of the Gnostics and Platonism and first principles. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, Dylan, for the introduction, and thanks very much for having me. It's an honor to be here talking about my research. So my presentation today has two goals. One, I aim to analyze the doctrine of the first principles and especially the divine intellect and its self-deployment in 5 Gnostic texts. And secondly, to argue that these Gnostic texts foreshadow and in fact influenced Plotinus's theory of the intellect. I have a slide. Dylan, would you be able to put that up?
No problem, one moment.
Thanks. And then once you put it up, you can just stay there for the whole presentation. And by the way, when I say Gnostic, I mean the classical Gnostic corpus, which is essentially the expanded Sethian corpus that includes now the Ophite evidence as well. So I do not use the term Gnosticism in any wider sense of the word. So for example, Valentinian texts do not fall under my definition of Gnosticism, just the Sethian Ophite documents, also known as classical Gnostic. And
Tuomas, why don't you go right ahead? The slide is coming.
Okay, but I want to continue by explaining my slide. So
okay, one moment.
Sure. And by the way, thank you, Zlatko, for your paper. I was still revising my paper until late last night, so I ended up doing something actually slightly different from my abstract and more akin to what you talked about. So it'll be interesting to hear your thoughts afterwards. Anyway, you can make that a bit bigger. Well, that might do. In any case, so in this slide, I have the 5 Gnostic texts in question numbered here, and they are in these brown boxes. On top of this diagram, I have what is a general intellectual background for these Gnostic speculations, which is the first 2 chapters of Genesis, where these Gnostic authors derive their speculation about the first principles. However, the first chapters of Genesis are read through the lenses of Jewish wisdom speculations, as well as Neopythagorean lore, with the end result that this kind of reading of Genesis is very close indeed to what we find in the works of Philo, as Zlatko pointed out. So these 5 Gnostic texts, I've arranged them in a rough chronological order. The first one is the so-called Ophite Theogony that survives only through a paraphrase by Irenaeus. That gives us the terminus ante quem to around roughly 180. On the other hand, the Ophite author appeals to Paul's 1 Corinthians as an authoritative text, which then gives us the terminus post quem. Paul wrote maybe around 55, but we must allow some time to pass before 1 Corinthians becomes an authoritative text, at least in some circles. So we could place the Ophite Theogony somewhere roughly between 80 and 180. We then have 2 kinds of rewritings of this Ophite Theogony in the Nag Hammadi library. The second text, Eugnostos, which is tested in 2 Coptic copies, and another type of rewriting of this Ophite Theogony in the Apocryphon of John, which is attested in no less than 4 Coptic copies, representing the shorter and longer version. Whereas the author of the Ophite Theogony read Genesis not only through the lenses of wisdom speculations and Neopythagorean lore, he also had lenses of Pauline Christology. With the author of the Apocryphon of John, his main lenses through which he reads all this is the Gospel of John and Johannine Christology. Then we have a dotted blue line in my diagram, which indicates that the first 3 texts really do form a group, sort of, and they do something very similar. They derive their first principles not only from the first chapter of the Genesis, but they do so specifically by concentrating on the idea that God created humanity as male and female after his own image and likeness. And I really should have expressed the first blue box, which says image of God, as a triad: God, image, first human, because that's how these texts really explain the coming into being of God's own self-understanding, the divine intellect. Then below the blue dotted line, we have 2 additional Gnostic texts, Zostrianos and Allogenes. Now, Zostrianos, they both come in only 1 Coptic manuscript. Zostrianos is actually quite fragmentary, hence the holes in my diagram with Zostrianos. We know that these 2 texts circulated in Plotinus' seminars in the 260s, so that provides us the terminus ante quem for these 2 texts. They, in many ways, can be approached as rewritings of the Apocryphon of John, its theogony. But this time, these 2 texts are no longer very interested in the image of God, or they also do not show any explicit Christological speculation. They are clearly Plotinian in some sense. They were produced in the wider circle of Plotinus, and probably were the Zostrianos, the rewriting of the Sethian theogony that we find there has been influenced and read through the lenses of early Plotinus, because the type of speculation we find about the first principles in Zostrianos is very similar to Plotinus's early works, where Plotinus was still allowing the one's transcendence to be compromised to some extent. And both Zostrianos and Allogenes express the first principles with the Plotinian being, life, mind triad, which, however, seems to derive from bits and pieces attested in the Apocryphon of John itself. In the Apocryphon of John, this being, life, mind triad, as well as Plotinus's procession and return scheme, are attested in, so let's say, in a nutshell. All the terminology is there, all the mechanics, building blocks of the mechanics are there, but only in Zostrianos and Allogenes do they become rearranged in the more familiar Plotinian form. And finally, Allogenes, the fifth text I want to talk about, makes some modifications to Zostrianos' compromised one. And these modifications in Allogenes are more or less in line with the development in Plotinus' own theory of the intellect, where he abandons his own earlier view, where the one was still somewhat compromised in his transcendence, and starts really stressing the absolute transcendence, absolute unity of the one. Okay, so just before I get to the Gnostic texts, I want to say a few things about Plotinus' theory of the intellect. So in his more mature works, the classic Plotinus holds that the one is the absolutely one, absolutely transcendent first principle beyond being an intellect. But because he's a monist, how does one, as the source of everything, but at the same time being completely cut off from everything, how does the one produce anything? And Plotinus' classic solution is that the one, without any effort or without diminishing, radiates or emanates otherness, which then must turn around, which proceeds out of the one, halts and turns around to gaze back at its source, seeing a mental representation of the one, if you like, which is itself, a mental self-image of the intellect, and thereby becoming the fully deployed intellect. Plotinus also uses this being-life-mind triad to explain the internal mechanics of the divine intellect once fully deployed. And he makes a tripartite division among the thinking subject, intellect, the object of its thinking, its existence or its being, and between these two poles, the thinking activity itself is the life of the intellect. But in his early works, Plotinus was still allowing the intellect to pre-exist within the one. This is, for example, the case in chronological numbers 7, 10, and 11, where the one has a higher form of intellect, higher form of life, and higher form of existence, which then become actualized at the level of the intellect. But this was uncharacteristic of Plotinus, and indeed, in his later career, he abandoned his own two-intellect theory as essentially a Gnostic misinterpretation of Timaeus 39. We'll get back to this later. And still, one more thing before we get to the Gnostic texts, namely Neopythagorean monistic derivational models. So Neopythagoreans, probably 1st century BC, introduced into the Greek philosophy the idea of monistic derivation, that everything, including the dyad or matter, derives from one single source, the monad or the one. But how does this happen? How does one become two? How does the monad produce the dyad? And this was, Neopythagoreans worked out three basic models. It can happen to one, during self-duplication, which could be poetically compared to the Narcissus myth, duplication in a mirror. Second option, self-division, which could be compared to the splitting of the original androgen. And the third option, that the monad contains all the numbers already in itself, potentially or seminally, and then it exteriorizes the dyad from which all the other numbers follow. And this could be compared to childbirth or birth from an egg, as in the Orphic myth of Phanes. And we'll find these solutions being used in the Gnostic theogonies. So the first Gnostic text to consider here is the so-called Ophite theogony. We have the first principle, who is the transcendent biblical God. He is infinite and imperishable. He's also a blessed primordial light and first human. He exists and he thinks, so this is not yet the Plotinian one. So this first principle produces a thought. This thought is then said to be his son, the Son of Man, the second human. Later in the text, we find out, and I mean, this is all based on Irenaeus's paraphrase, so some details must be lost. So we must gather hints as to some of the missing details later from things that mentioned later in the text, and also from Eugnostos and the Apocryphon of John, which are essentially rewritings of the Zophite Theogony. But in any case, so in the Ophite Theogony, the first principle produces a thought, which is identified as his son. Later in the text, we find out that this son, in fact, provides the model for Adam's creation. So this son is, his thought is, in fact, the image of God after which Adam was created. But what we have here also is that the first principle's thought appears as a self-image and becomes thus the object of his self-thinking, which now materializes as his own image. Then we are told that there's also a first woman who is the Spirit of God at creation, but also a heavenly Eve figure, because she's given the title of Eve from Genesis, mother of all living. We are not told where she came from, but later on in the text, we are told that she provides the model for the earthly Eve's creation. So in fact, the first woman appears to be the feminine aspect of the image of God. She also functions as the receptacle. She receives the light of the first principle and receives the light and gives birth to light from light, who is identified as a third human, but in fact, this is the first created human, created by God through his logos image after the image of God. This also, because this son is light from light and a human, presupposes the famous Greek wordplay on the word phos, which, depending on the accentuation, can mean either light or human. This becomes a staple of Gnostic exegesis of Genesis, that the first created man was a light Adam. And this is what we have here as well. This light Adam is then identified also as Christ, following Paul's Adam Christology in 1 Corinthians. Paul also says in 1 Corinthians that Christ is the wisdom of God. And indeed, this light Adam, the first created light human after the image, is an androgyne. And just like the earthly Adam in Genesis 2 was created out of earth, and Eve was then taken out of his side, out of his rib, thus splitting the original androgyne, we find the same myth here on the heavenly level. This androgynous light Adam is also an androgyne who gets split right at the beginning, because the receptacle mother who receives the light of the father cannot contain all the light. Some of the light spills out from her side and falls down to the waters below. This is Sophia, Christ's, or the light Adam's consort and psychikos. She animates the waters, thus becoming the world soul. She also assumes a watery body from these waters, which weighs her down. So eventually she casts the body off. This body then becomes the evil demiurge, Yaldabaoth. But because Sophia had previously worn this body, the body contains a residue of light. Later on, Sophia fools Yaldabaoth to blow this residue of light into the earthly Adam, who thereby gains nous, intellect. But because this residue of light was some of the same light that out of which the light Adam itself was created after the image, and gave nous to the earthly Adam, the same light up there must be nous also. This is somewhat sketchy, and we will see this much more clearly in Eugnostos and the Apocryphon of John. But let me just recap what we have here in the Ophite Theogony. The first God puts out a thought, and this must be the self-thinking Aristotelian Middle Platonic divine self-intellect. He's engaging in some sort of self-thinking, he produces a thought which materializes as his own image, which becomes the object of thinking. And this image then produces a son who becomes the full-blown nous, the full-blown divine, fully deployed divine intellect. So now we have also the thinking subject on the scene. So we have this tripartite thinking subject, the object of its thinking, and the pure thought, pure thinking activity, which is very similar to what we later find in Plotinus. Like I said, this becomes clearer in the Nakamadi texts that are not paraphrases, but translations. So in Eugnostos, which is essentially an expansion and rewriting of this Ophytheogony, the first principle is again described in a very similar term as the Ophytheogony, as infinite and imperishable, the blessed, first existent one. He's the father of all, or rather, as the author specifies, he shouldn't be called father, but forefather. He's unbegotten and eternal. He embraces and contains everything, but only insofar as he is their source. So this unbegotten first principle is said to have nous and ennoia and enthymesis, phronesis, logismos, dynamis, but he has these only insofar as he is their source. So they are not actually present, they're only potentially present in him. The author of Eugnostos also employs negative theology in describing the first principle, among which is that he is unknowable. The first principle can only be known by itself, but this turns out to be a process. The self-knowledge so in thinking himself, his own likeness appears as in a mirror. So we have the same mirror metaphor as in the Apocryphon of John. And again, this thinking literally manifests as a likeness in a mirror. So again, the object of one's self-thinking appears as in a mirror. This likeness in a mirror is then identified as self-begotten, self-father. And indeed, the mirror analogy works well in this in service of this concept of auto-generation, because consider the analogy of an artist who wants to produce a self-portrait. She can either paint on a canvas, which requires effort, or she can simply be in front of a mirror, and the mirror does all the work for you. There's your self-image right there, no effort. So here the mirror analogy appears to explain how the second principle can self-generate out of the first one without any effort on the part of the first one. Now, this could go back to Neopythagorean self-duplication model, which sometimes was used, which was sometimes clarified with the Narcissus myth, where duplication happens in a mirror. This could lurk in the background. However, in the wisdom of Solomon, we find out that not only is the wisdom of God, God's sort of logos-like tool in creation, she's also God's image and God's spotless mirror. And in any case, this likeness in a mirror is then also identified as light. And in the beginning, he creates his own likeness, which turns out to be the first immortal human. Again, we have the idea of light Adam, who is simultaneously the first act of creation, let there be light, but also the first human created after the image and likeness of God. As I said, staple feature of Gnostic exegesis of Genesis. And this light Adam now, the third principle, he actually possesses nous, ennoia, enthymesis, phronesis, logismos, dynamis. These were present in the unbegotten first principle only insofar as he contained them potentially. He was their source. But now, on the level of the third principle, they become actualized. So once again, the fully deployed divine intellect has now appeared on the scene. So first principle produces a thought, engages in unlimited or unspecified self-thinking, whose object then appears as in a mirror, bringing forth the fully cognizant divine subject. Let me just then move on to the Apocryphon of John, where again we have a variant of the same scheme. So the first principle, once again, is described in similar terms. He's the transcendent biblical God, the Father of all, who is ineffable, immeasurable, and his essence consists of light. The author of the Apocryphon, like the author of Eugnostos, employs, and this time much more negative theology in describing the first principle. He is the head of every eon, and he has what he gives, but in a superior form. For example, he is life-giving life, but does not need life himself. He is blessedness giving blessedness, who surpasses blessedness. He also exists, yet is not among those who exists, but superior to them. So he's somehow beyond being. He also thinks himself. And in thinking himself, he sees his own image in his own light water, which is obviously a metaphor, as Slatko also pointed out. This manifested self-image is not only the object of the self-thinking, she's also the image of God, the first human androgen, called triple power. She now has a name, Barbelo. And like in the Ophite scheme, this image functions as the receptacle who receives the Father's light. But this time we have something very interesting. It is Barbelo, the mirror image, who initiates the gaze. She looks the Father right in the eye and conceives from his light. And this is nice. Slatko just pointed out how the eyes were thought to emit light. So here we have an actual application of this idea. Barbelo as the mirror image is the active one, at least in the short recension of the Apocryphon. She engages in a fertile gaze with the Father and conceives from this gaze, conceives light from light, gives birth to a son, light from light, who is then again this light Adam, who is again here identified as a Christ figure. Now, there's this mythological drama in the Apocryphon of John's narrative, whereby Barbelo, as the likeness in the mirror, must stand in front of the Father and ask for her own attributes, such as eternal life and foreknowledge and indestructibility. These then appear, Father grants them to her, they appear, they all praise the Father, and take their place in the heavenly courtroom, if you like. And Christ must do the same thing. He must ask for nous and logos and so on. Of course, this is just a mythological context. What really this means that Christ is nous. So again, we have the same triad. The Father engages in some sort of unspecified self-thinking. I'm not sure how much to make of the fact that the author, at least in the Coptic version, uses the infinitival form noein. But this could be meaningful in terms of paronymic development. So this is some sort of unspecified self-thinking whose object then appears in a mirror, which then leads to the appearance of the fully deployed divine nous, the subject of this thinking. And I believe this not only foreshadows, and this is found in all these three Gnostic texts, the Ophites, Eugnostos, and the Apocryphon of John. These texts clearly foreshadow Plotinus's theory of the intellect, especially in Plotinus's early works. We have this triple distinction among thinking subject, its object, and the thinking activity itself. We have the rudimentary forms of the being-life-mind triad, as well as its variant existence-life-blessedness triad. They're not formalized as triads yet in these texts, but all the terminology is used and used of the Father, or Barbelo, or the image. Likewise, the basic building blocks of Plotinus's procession-and-return scheme seem to be found here in these texts, because when Plotinus says that the intellect, as the emanated otherness out of the one, proceeds out of the one, but then must halt and turn around to gaze back at its source. Well, this is really two different things. The exteriorization, or the proceeding out of womb, if you like, is sort of a childbirth metaphor, one hand. And then on the other hand, we have the gazing back at the source, which is exactly the mirror metaphor here in the Apocryphon of John. So these building blocks are there, they're just used in a different order. But all this then becomes, all this material, raw material from the Apocryphon of John especially, then becomes recognizably Plotinian when it's rearranged in Zostrianos and Allogenes. So let's first look at Zostrianos. In many ways, Zostrianos can be considered to be a rewriting of the Apocryphon of John's theogony. The basic theogony is still the same in Zostrianos as it is in the Apocryphon of John. We have the invisible spirit and we have Barbelo. And a lot of the other entities in the divine realm are also the same. However, this time there is no son of Barbelo. Barbelo herself is no longer the receptacle. In fact, she has become the son, the fully deployed divine nous, who comes out of, who has seminal existence within the one, then comes out of the one's womb, as it, if you like, proceeds out of her seminal existence in the one, proceeds as the first manifesting intellect, but then halts and must turn around and gaze back at the one as the image, much like she did in the Apocryphon of John. And there's a remarkable passage in Zostrianos that is not only similar to Plotinus's early works, but is in fact identical with a section in Marius Victorinus, which Pierre Hadot once thought was written by Porphyry. But now Michel Tardieu showed that this parallel in Victorinus and Zostrianos is in fact that there's this parallel to one of these fragments in Victorinus, which comes exactly in the same form as in Zostrianos. And once Pierre Hadot read this argument, he admitted that, yes, okay, this one fragment at least does not come from Porphyry, but is Gnostic. So here we have in Zostrianos this remarkable passage where the invisible spirit, the first principle, the invisible one, is said to, in his simplicity, to unite his own triple power of existence, life, blessedness. And this triad seems to correspond to Barbelo's triple deployment out of the one. She first exists as hidden kalyptos within the one, then proceeds out as the first manifesting intellect, and finally turns around to gaze back at the source as the autogenes nous. So again, we have the same triple deployment of the divine intellect, which now is said to exist seminally within the one, and then proceeds in the Plotinian order out of the one and turns around to gaze back at the source as the image. Barbelo in Zostrianos is also identified as the first principle's self-knowledge. She has now become the very embodiment, not only as the image of the one, but also the embodiment and image of his own self-knowledge as the fully deployed divine nous, again in three stages. And as I said, this is similar to Plotinus, some of Plotinus's early works, where Plotinus still allowed both the intellect, but also the being, life, mind triad that describes the internal mechanics of the intellect to exist seminally within the one. The one has higher form of existence, higher form of life, and higher form of mind, which he then exteriorizes, and these become actual on the level of the intellect. This is what we find in some of Plotinus's early works, and it's pretty much exactly what we find in Zostrianos and later in Victorinus. And finally, a few words about Allogenes. It's essentially well, the author clearly knew the Apocryphon of John, quite possibly also Zostrianos, because there are some subtle modifications to what we find in Zostrianos in Allogenes that seem to coincide with Plotinus's own development. the development of Plotinus' own theory of intellect, which stresses in his later works the absolute transcendence of the one. And this is also what we find now in Allogenes. The triple power of Zostrianos, which allowed the one to seminally possess the existence, life, and blessedness, or the triple deployment of Barbelo, has now been almost exteriorized out of the one, and this triple power has now become almost a sort of a mediating entity between the one and Barbelo. The author of Allogenes also stresses much stronger than any other Gnostic author before him the unknowability of the one. Allogenes also is interested in teaching its reader how to obtain a mystical vision of the one. The author uses the concept of learned ignorance, much like Plotinus, and says that the one cannot be attained, but only the level of the triple power, which is the level just below the one, but higher than the fully deployed intellect. So all this is very similar to Plotinus's later works. One thing, however, which we find in Allogenes that is not found in Plotinus, which was once thought to be the invention by Porphyry, is the Enneadic restructuring of the being, life, mind triad, in that each of the three contains the other two. They're all mutually present, mutually implicated. So, but we have this idea that the being, life, mind triad is an Ennead in Allogenes. And again, Pierre Hadot thought that this would have been Porphyry's invention, who combined Plotinus's triad with what he found from the Chaldean oracles. But we can just as well explain the Enneadic restructuring of the being, life, mind triad as essentially a Gnostic development. The Apocryphon of John already contained a rudimentary form of the triad. Then it becomes formalized in Zostrianos and Allogenes. But the Apocryphon of John already uses the paronymic distinctions between various forms of these, like, for example, in the classic formula of the Enneadic structuring, we have different cognates of the same word used to express the degrees of difference between being and life and mind. We find something similar already in the Apocryphon of John, in that the first principle thinks noein, and then this on the third level becomes fully blown nous. The concept of mutual implication, which is important in the Enneadic restructuring, is not found clearly in the Apocryphon of John, but it is, interestingly enough, found in the Gospel of John, to which the Apocryphon points clearly its readers. And the Gospel of John has always been important for Christian Neoplatonists. Just look at Victorinus. And in the Gospel of John, which the author of Allogenes may well have read alongside the Apocryphon of John, in the Gospel of John, we have several statements where Jesus says that Father and I are one. Father is in me, I am in the Father. And they both also contain life. Just like Father has life in him, I have life in me, Jesus says somewhere else in the fourth Gospel. So one could derive the Enneadic restructuring of the being, life, mind triad also from simply within the Christian Gnostic tradition. So that's pretty much what I wanted to say about these 5 Gnostic texts, how they describe the first principles, how they describe God's the deployment of the divine intellect in 3 stages, making the Platinian distinction between thinking subject, object, and activity itself. The origins of this idea come from the image of God speculations from Genesis, which are then given this more familiar Plotinian being, life, mind modification in Zostrianos and Allogenes, probably resulting from a fruitful dialogue between these Gnostic authors and younger Plotinus. Plotinus says that he had Gnostic friends once with whom he eventually broke up with. But what we find in Zostrianos in particular seems to demand, almost in my opinion, some sort of fruitful dialogue between these Gnostic authors and Plotinus. So that's what I wanted to say, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Tuomas, for this delightful paper. Extremely clear layout of the various building blocks of the various stages of Sethian Platonic teaching, also discussed in detail with reference to Plotinus's own thought, bringing in, of course, not only Platonist and Pythagorean, but also biblical intertexts at stake for all parties, perhaps. Questions and comments for Tuomas from the audience? Yeah, Luciana.
Hi, Thomas. Thank you very much for this wonderful paper. And I was wondering which passages of Plotinus are you using and thinking about, and if you saw a difference in the text of Plotinus, chronologically speaking, a kind of evolution or differences about this text that you are using or thinking on.
Yes, so some of I mentioned quickly, there's 3 early treatises, 5.4, which is chronological number 7, then 5.1, chronological number 10, and 5.2, number 11. So in these 3 texts, at least, we have the idea that Plotinus still clearly compromises the one's transcendence by allowing it to be either the noeton, the object of the intellect's thinking, or allows the one to have some sort of higher form of intellect and life and existence, which then are technically speaking beyond regular existence or regular intellect, but nonetheless, the one is said to have some sort of higher form of these things, especially 5.4.
But you didn't use it the last treatises of Plotinus. You just thinking about these 3, 7, 10, and 11.
No, and then in later text, of course, there's a whole bunch of them where Plotinus explains the internal mechanics of the intellect by using the being, life, mind triad to make this distinction between the intellect, who is the thinking subject, that's the mind, the object of its thinking, which is its existence or being, and then the thinking activity itself, combining the subject to object, which is its life. And this you find throughout the Plotinian corpus, also obviously in the later text as well. And the closest Plotinus in his later works comes to his early works is that he when he explains how did the intellect come into being out of the one who is the source of everything, but also at the same time completely cut off from everything, so to speak. So he posits there's this otherness that emanates, like sun emanates heat and light. The one without diminishing emanates otherness, which Zeke Mazur called the pre-noetic efflux. Plotinus also gave it a lot of different names. One of them was life, one of them was otherness. And this otherness then itself must limit itself by turning around and gazing back towards where it came from. But obviously it cannot conceive of the one. So it must create some sort of object for its own thinking, which then is in fact its own self-image, which is the next best thing. So in these later works, Plotinus does everything he can to safeguard the transcendence of the one in this way, which he didn't do in some of his early works.
The other question I have, it was just for me. You mentioned that for about one point, Ado have admitted that this not come from Neoplatonics of Porphyry, but comes from probably agnostic text. But I didn't note which part you were quoting, you were referring about the passage.
So there's actually 2 different things here. Ado, at least, I mean, he wrote mainly before the Nakamari texts were found and published. So in 50s and early 60s, he argued that Plotinus would have, first of all, because Plotinus uses the being, life, mind triad throughout his corpus, but never really explains where he got this idea, just uses it. Adele thought that he must have simply found it in some now lost Middle Platonic handbook. But that seems to be an unnecessary hypothesis, in my opinion, because we don't have such a handbook, first of all, but we do have these Gnostic texts, which are many of which are pre-Platinian, and you find the rudimentary forms, the terminology of the triad right there. And the second thing is that Adele then also thought that Porphyry would have rearranged the triad into an Ennead, having been inspired by both by Plotinus, but also by the Chaldean oracles. That may be, but we also find this Enneadic restructuring in Allogenes, and you could derive this all this Enneadic restructuring also from the Apocryphon of John and the Gospel of John, without any influence from Porphyry or the Chaldean oracles. It's possible. I don't know how likely it is, but it is possible.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Robert Birchman has posted some questions to the chat. Rob, perhaps you'd like to jump in and pose them to us in the discussion?
Yeah. I was thinking through, thank you, Tuomas, thank you very much. I don't think I've seen you since Prague. Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Connection is not great. If you want, I'll read them out.
All right, I have a second one. I have a second one coming.
I see it.
Yeah.
So two comments from Rob. Thank you, Rob. And if the connection improves, jump in. Rob observes an important one. One of the building blocks that wasn't in the presentation, but of course is crucial for Plotinus, is Aristotle's Metaphysics 12. This is the thought thinking itself, right? A crucial intertext for the Middle Platonists and conceiving of the divine mind, and also for Plotinus and surely the Gnostics as well. And Plotinus follows up on this in 5.3 and 1.6. So Rob offered two questions that following from this. First, do we know of Gnostic sources engaging Aristotle directly? So not just Plato, Platonic intertexts for the Gnostics, but also Aristotelian intertexts. And second, back to Metaphysics 12, this is a numerical identity between thought and the thinker in Aristotle, but for Plotinus and the Gnostics, this seems to be a qualitative or iconic. What does that seem right to you? What do you think, Tuomas?
Well, I mean, the reason I didn't mention Aristotle in this regard in my slide is that it's just basic Middle Plate. It's become basic Middle Platonic doctrine that the highest principle is self-thinking divine intellect. That basically goes with the territory. I don't think to my knowledge, we don't have any actual direct engagement with Aristotle in the Nakamata corpus, for example. But also, it's very rare in the classic Gnostic corpus to find quotes of Plato either. I think Zeke Mazer identified some. They weren't quotes of Plato, but he found clear traces of clear use of Plato's dialogues in Zostrianos. But we're not dealing with any actual quotes, so it's more like this probably presupposes dependence on this passage in this dialogue. As for Aristotle's self-thinking mind, I think it just goes with the territory.
Yeah, Mazer is working mainly with the Sophist, the emergence of the five kinds of the Sophist, and then
it wasn't just that. He also identified other passages. So the Sophist passage 248 is what Pierre Hadot thought the being, life, mind triad would have been derived out of in this hypothetical handbook. But it seems to me it's very difficult to take those three, being and life and mind, out of that passage and leave everything else out. Why would you do that? I think it's more likely that Plotinus learned of or even in fact developed the triad himself with the Gnostics from these Gnostic ingredients, and then himself connected it with the Sophist passage because he found it to be compatible with Plato, and that made all the difference for Plotinus. That's why I believe he began using the triad, because he found it to be compatible with a passage in Plato.
That might be a good way to begin the discussion and further iterations of this project. You know, what's the being, life, mind triad? Ado's answer is clearly suggestive, but doesn't seem to be completely convincing. What are some alternatives? You know, yeah, always start with a problem. Other questions, comments?
Thank you so
Yes.
much. If I just thank you for the paper, and I was very attentively listening to the ways in which you were retelling or summarizing the Orphite theology, the Orphite story, paying attention to the code switching that you were doing all the time. It's really so that's, you know, this blending of analogies that you have to somehow resolve in summarizing the talk. So you were constantly switching from myth to this, you know, psychology, code, and everything else. So that was in a way, you know, interesting, you know, for me to listen after I spent so much time working on these analogies. How do people retell the Gnostic story, right? You know, with so many different, right, you know, codes, right, that are involved. But my question is about Philo of Alexandria. We agree that both Philo and at least some Gnostic texts, you know, are kind of really closely connected, right? They show many affinities, not only philosophical but also literary. So in that regard, actually, back to the Johannine influence, especially on the Apocryphon of John, that I know Jean Daniel wrote an article on. I also fully agree with that. But is it really, besides this, you know, Christ figure, couple of references, is it really the case that, you know, actually many of those so-called Johannine features can be traced back to Philo? So that the predominant Johannine influence actually impact on some Gnostic texts, some Setian Gnostic texts, you know, might not be so.
Well, in the case of the Apocryphon, because the framework around that whole text, which identifies the text,
Right,
as a dialogue between the risen Jesus and John, the son of Zebedee, to whom the fourth gospel was credited from early on.
right.
That obviously gives you a very Johannine.
If you accept that this is a kind of, you know, organic part of the text, of course, which many scholars previously tried to deny, right?
Yeah, but I mean, so that's the frame story, and you can find that some characterizations of, for example, the first principle is, unlike in the O5 Theogony and Eugnostos, the first principle is now called invisible spirit, right? And people have wondered where does this come from, but it could simply come from the Gospel of John, where God is called Spirit in chapter 4, and then the statement, no one has ever seen God. You combine these two, you get the invisible.
That's for me, that was the
That's
key.
one. But I mean,
That was the
obviously,
key, right?
sort of like Philo-like interpretation of Genesis, especially read through Paul's lenses in 1 Corinthians, which, by the way, in itself, Paul in 1 Corinthians engages in this Philo-like interpretation of Genesis. That is by far more important in the background than any Johannine influence. I think the Johannine influence is clearly something secondary. But it becomes important in the Apocryphon of John, at least.
Thank you.
There's also a question in the chat.
From Stefan Marinka. Thank you, Stefan, also for clarifying your identity. Fidegusa, Stefan. Stefan asks, the generation of the nous in Plotinus is achieved by giving the one what the one does not possess, which is the opposite of the Gnostic doctrine in Zostrianos, which unifies in the simplicity of the one, the being, life, mind triad. Do the Gnostics not defend a more middle Platonic position rather than a Plotinian position where the first principle thinks itself?
So I think this shows the development in Plotinus' own thought. In his early works, he still allows the one to actually have intellect and being and life in these higher forms, which are then exteriorized out of the one into the actualized triadic intellect. And this is what we find in Zostrianos. That's why I think Zostrianos must have been produced in some sort of dialogue with the earlier, younger Plotinus. But then soon afterwards, Plotinus develops the idea that the one is completely cut off from everything else. And indeed, the otherness that emanates, which gives rise to the intellect, is something that the one doesn't really have. It's this natural byproduct of its sameness and oneness. So that big, like, how do we define Neoplatonism? Is it Plotinus completely Neoplatonist? There are some Platonists chronologically after Plotinus who are still dualists instead of monists. So it depends how we define. Is it purely a Plotinian thing? Is it a chronological thing? Or does it have to do with some of the doctrines? So if we think Neoplatonism must be completely monistic and that one must be completely transcendent, then early Plotinus is still a middle Platonist in that case. But I think that's well, I don't know. What do you think?
I think it's a good question, and we surely should factor in the invention of tradition that the Platonists themselves practiced in describing and creating lineages of correct doctrine that we see as we see in Eunapius, Proclus, and Damascus, especially the golden chain of the Athenian school, where so many pre-Plotinian thinkers and also post-Plotinian thinkers who are unlike Plotinus, who are not modest like Plotinus, get written out. That surely plays a big factor for how we conceive of it. Other questions, comments? Yeah, Luciana. Oh, Luciana, we cannot get to unmute. Yes, there we are.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Yes, just if I try to summarize, if I can. So what I was thinking before. So you think that Plotinus has, from the beginning to the end of his treatises, been influenced by the Gnostics in the description of the generation and constitution of the intellect, but that the great difference in the later treatises compared to those you quoted, the first ones in the beginning, is that he better preserves in the end the transcendence of the principle. Because I'm thinking about, particularly in the descriptions that he gave in the treatise 32, that it's an anti-Gnostic treatise. So I want to understand better how he positioned these descriptions about the generation of the intellect in this anti-Gnostic treatise can be a critic of the Gnostics. This was my point, what I was thinking when I put the question for you before.
Yeah, so in his early works, he is certainly influenced, I think, by the Gnostic position. But then he changes his mind, begins to preserve the one's transcendence. But in the Gnostic and the Gnostic treatise, whether you just talk about 33 or the whole possible Koschrift, Plotinus's criticism, especially in 33, is not really against the one and the intellect. It's more about Sophia and the the creation of the cosmos and the evil nature of the demiurge and all that. and also that there are too many sub-levels, sub-hypostatic levels that they posit. So that may or may not have something to do with these triadic speculations. Especially in Allogenes, we then get this sort of multiplication of levels, because they're the triple power that Zostrianos posited still within the one, which is essentially the being life mind triad in its seminal form. Then in Allogenes, this becomes some sort of a sub-level between the invisible one and Barbelo. So that could be part of Plotinus's criticism in 33. And I'm not sure, like in his younger years, he was certainly, I think, in dialogue with the Gnostics, and they were both developing this idea of how the one generates intellect in 3 stages, with the being life mind triad being employed. I'm not sure how far this Gnostic dialogue and influence then continues, but certainly left a mark from early on, and Plotinus never really gave up some central ideas that I think he did inherit from the Gnostics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because in the treatise 32, I think particularly in the chapter 5 and 7, and also he gives a very specific and precise description about this intellect, aimant, intellect pensant. So he really organized, and he will do it again in the 38. And we just have this 2 or 3, even in the 50 treatise, these descriptions, very accurate description of how they come from the intellect and how is structured, these 3 moments, metaphysical. So I was wondering if you have just looked at this text and to see even the influence, not necessarily the differences, but how Plotinus put this in a way very more philosophical and in relation to this heritage that he had from the Gnostics. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. I can't answer you right now, but could you put those specific passages in the chat, and I will take a very close look.
Yeah, thank you.
Sure.
Good questions, Luciana. Christian Bull has a question.
Thanks. Can you hear me? Thanks, Tuomas. This was great as always. I was looking at your marvelous magnum opus and your Ophite diagram there, where you lay out the different mythological systems that you identify as making up the classic Gnostic mythology. So I just wanted a clarification that there you say that Apocryphon of John partakes of the Ophite mythology as well as the Barbelowite and the Sethite mythology, right? Yeah. However, you locate Marsanus and Zostrianos as belonging to the Barbelowite/Sethite mythology, and outside the sort of circle of Ophitism. So I was wondering, have you changed your mind there, or do you mean that there's a more narrow specific thing that's not exclusive to Ophite mythology that's transmitted to these texts?
Well, I think I'm in a good company, because like Plotinus, I have changed my mind. So yeah, indeed, I wrote that book, what's that, 20 years ago almost. And at that time, I wasn't looking at the Ophite mythology from a Platonic viewpoint at all. I was more interested in the sort of mythological aspect of it. So I guess I would have to rethink that diagram in my dissertation to some extent. But it's true that the Apocryphon of John is a text that combines a whole lot of different sources. It's much more than just a rewriting of the Ophite diachrony. That's just one ingredient that goes in it. And then when Zostrianos, for example, rewrites the Apocryphon of John, the author of Zostrianos, I don't think, had direct access to the Ophite materials anymore. Everything comes through the filter of the Apocryphon of John, right? So in that sense, I guess my old diagram would still work. But yeah, basically I have changed my mind in the sense that I've now started looking at the Ophite mythology also from this Platonic Pythagorean viewpoint. So yeah.
Thanks. We wait the revised edition then.
Second edition.
I'm looking forward to it. Also in NHMS, Thomas. We have time for one more question from Robert Birchman. He asked in the chat about the role that the indefinite dyad plays in the Nag Hammadi sources regarding the emergence of Nous. Where does the indefinite dyad come into it with the Nag Hammadi sources?
Well, I mean, I suppose Barbelo as the receptacle does function. It also, in some sense, as the dyad, indefinite dyad. But the whole, I'm not sure.
I mean, it's a good question. I think Turner pointed towards Barbelo and the receptacle, but as for the dyad as a principle of actual multiplicity and darkness, and if one takes a full Middle Platonic reading, materiality, right?
I think Sophia would play more that role.
Yeah, Sophia or even Yaldabaoth, I think. Zlatko, any thoughts on this? You've visited the question of dualism and these principles, particularly in Plutarch, who has a lot to say about this matter in a number of your articles.
Right, but Plutarch, I'm thinking about this, the Delphico, right? But in Plutarch, we have otherness, right? Heterotes playing that role, right? In his description of the one. So it is heterotes rather than dias itself. Now, if you want to, of course, I'm trying to be specific. Is there any, what was the question? What role does the indefinite dyad play in Nag Hammadi sources? Right? So I cannot think of any place where the dyad shows up as a term, first of all, right? But as Tuomas pointed out, clearly Barbelo, because of her indeterminate thoughts, enoia, right? Because of her being called mother, father, because of this kind of coincidence of the opposites, right? Clearly performs that dyadic function. In addition to, of course, as Thomas pointed out, being called the womb of creation. So yes, this is that kind of, necessary secondary principle out of which then the whole, right, pleroma can originate. In that regard, absolutely. I think that actually we do have dyadic elements in that second principle.
It just occurred to me that I already mentioned that Zostrianos seems to present something very similar to especially early Plotinus, but like when Plotinus presents the one emanating as a byproduct, this otherness. In Plotinus, this otherness that is the not yet intellect, so to speak. It's the pure unlimited otherness that must be limited by becoming intellect, self-limited. Right. So that definitely in Plotinus seems to play some sort of role of the indefinite dyad. And in Zostrianos, when Barbelo emerges as the proto-phanes, the first manifesting nous, it's actually even said in Zostrianos, although it's very fragmentary, it's hard to say exactly what the author says, but there is a passage where Barbelo's extension out of the one as the protophanes must be halted so she doesn't go indefinitely, and then she must turn around. So there's this moment of indefiniteness to Barbelo's emergence in Zostrianos as the protophanes stage. So if we accept that Plotinus has the concept of intelligible matter as this pre-noetic efflux of this otherness, then yes, we have something very similar in Zostrianos in the deployment phase of protophanes. Yeah.
So within the Barbelo, after all, we are out of time. 2.5 hours of Platonism, Gnosticism, and first principles. I'd like to once again thank both of our speakers, Zdako Pleše of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and Tuomas Rasimus of the University of Helsinki for their terrific contributions. And finally, all of you, the audience, for coming and engaging in this discussion with us. Thank you all for being here.
Thanks. It was great.
Thank you. Thank you very much for everyone for being here, and see you in the next meeting in December.
Yeah, I look forward to it.
Thank you.